Welcome back to Beagle Eye Visions Internet. We are still on episode number 8 of the CubbyWhole podcast entitled Ancient Egyptian Mythos. Douglas Martin is dropping on us some insane amount of wisdom and knowledge. So we're going to keep running it. Thank you if you made it this far. Let's go.
Roman Church. So what the Roman Church did effectively was that they packaged and labeled the exoteric religion and then went to war on the secret societies. Because the secret societies, remember, were the necessary vital function of the society where you could go first choosing your exoteric faith and then go into, because see, even in modern masonry, they accept all faiths. Whatever your book of faith is, they welcome into that society. Then they want to give you the tools to flesh out the deeper esoteric meaning of your exoteric faith or your exoteric religion or your exoteric doctrine. But without those tools, that's not really possible. So why is that? And, I didn't try to avoid your question, but see, this is what we're getting to. What are these tools? We have to understand that the ancients spiritualized everything, so that every new discovery of knowledge was sacred. So what they were endeavoring to do was find ways to preserve that knowledge, so they spiritualized it. Every new discovery was sacred. What did that mean? It meant that it had to be put into a stage of repetition where it can't get lost, and that it was there to serve us to gain a better understanding of truth, which corresponds to the one great spirit. The closer we get to the science of causes, puts us in direct proximity with our Creator. So by the idea of forming a relationship with our Creator has to be earned, because it's about learning a science of causality. So the more we understand causality, the closer proximity we're coming to our Creator, the cause of causes. So the idea is that they spiritualized everything and became sacred. So this idea of worship, it's a corrupted idea because it came from repetition of ritual. And the idea of repetition of ritual was the method of preserving the knowledge and making sure it got passed forward to the new generations. In a vestigial form, we would call that worship, because that's what worship is. It's like externalizing our faith instead of internalizing our work. So worship in itself, that term, it represents a corruption of ritual, which represents a repetition as a vital function to pass knowledge forward, and constitutes an increase of understanding, an increase in our learning. So what I'm trying to say is, by spiritualizing the tools or the implementation, in the implementation, we find the evolution. In other words, I want to say, starting with axe, when we have stone on the stick, what we might call hammer, axe, was better to associate and understand with axe. We're hafting stone onto stick. I'm trying not to go directly into that because it's a big topic. But just, from our first earliest implementation forward, we know axe or hammer came before bow. And, we know that hafting stone on the stick came before metallurgy. And then we know that we can't have sword or blade until we have the metallurgy. So that's where we find this evidence of this evolution in the implementation. I'm trying to respond to your question. So it's in the implementation, and then after we have metallurgy and sword, and we, I'm trying to avoid terms like Bronze Age, Iron Age, because those bolster the ideas of the Yuga cycles and gives us a distorted vision of what the evolution is really about. But just pay attention to the implementation. So after sword, ultimately we come to gunpowder. And then following gunpowder, we find improvements and applications of gunpowder, and then ultimately projectile weaponry, and then into the modern age of technology, which is just beyond our wildest imagination now what the technology for weaponry specifically can be, but, particularly want to use the term implementation. So we'll back up a little bit with this. The tools that you would be given in the mystery schools to flesh out the meaning of your exoteric faith and understand the esoteric understanding of the faith. I want to think of it in terms of learning a science, and that this is what constitutes what we know as, or think of as, the mystery schools, which give us access to the mysteries themselves. And that without these tools, it's not possible to access it. So one of the things to understand is what makes losing ancient knowledge so dangerous, because it took so long to develop and understand. And then the further we drift or go astray from pure forms, we may never be able to recover it, because we're talking about a knowledge base that took hundreds of thousands of years to develop and understand. And then since it got lost, we've only been in, only 50,000 years have passed, and now we have a world filled with dogma. So not only do we have to figure out a way to get back to, where it starts to go awry, but we have to understand how it evolved to that point from the pure forms of totemic sociology, which became early hero cults. And then those hero cults evolving the mythology to ultimately into the eschatology, and then perfecting the eschatology, and then changing the types and straying from the original to the point where it starts to go into a deteriorated form, ultimately ending up fully anthropomorphized. So, I'm trying to go right back over the same original questions to keep putting it into a perspective that we can work with. And I just want to try to wrap up this section with this, is that, there's a natural order to things, and there's a linear trajectory of the early evolution of the human mental processes. And I do want to throw this in there, just, from the totemic sociology into the first hero cults, which is stellar. First, they propitiated the one great spirit. Then they propitiated ancestry. And that's the point where we know religion begins, because they're demonstrating behaviors that show their belief in an everlasting existence and an after world for the journey of the soul. So that's where religion begins, where they propitiate ancestry. So first they propitiate the one great spirit. Then they propitiate ancestry. Then ultimately they propitiate elemental powers. And the point where they propitiate ancestry is the point where we can say religion begins, because they're demonstrating behaviors that show their belief in an everlasting soul. And modern, quote, scholars have made the mistake that the ancient elders would never have made, and they've confused and construed propitiation of ancestry with propitiation of elemental powers. And this is where we get the idea of the demigod. This is where we get the idea that gods from heaven came down to earth and mingled with the daughters of men. So it's addressing some of the central dogma. We have to understand, and I just said it, I'm going to say it one more time. Modern scholars have made a mistake that the ancient elders would never have made, and they've confused and construed propitiation of ancestry with propitiation of elemental powers. And I'm not even getting warmed up.
Well, that's a great place to take our break, because we're coming up on the hour, and we will continue with the mythos. And Doug will also, I'm going to ask him about the CubbyWhole and what his take is on that. So stay tuned, and we'll see you on the other side.
All right, so we don't really have time to take a break, because the PS4...
His work can be found right here at CubbyWhole.com.
The PS4 is probably going to cut us off, so hopefully the PS4 will not cut us off, and we're going to keep going here.
What is your take on the meaning and significance of the CubbyWhole?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I definitely wanted to extrapolate some on that subject. I've been paying attention to your early podcasts, and I was very anxious to jump in and throw in my 2 cents on that. It's actually very, very significant, because it represents a repository, a place where we can store the knowledge. So part of understanding the ancient culture is understanding what they're endeavoring to do. And what they're endeavoring to do is find ways to preserve the knowledge as well as to pass the knowledge forward to the new generations. And that's very, very important to understand. So this idea of the cubbyhole, which is also associated with the source of creation, the archetypal womb, if you will, which is associated with the motherhood. The idea that the divinized motherhood is more in line or more representative of the creation or the creative force. As I said before, the fatherhoods were not divinized until partway into the solar phase of the evolution of the mythos. So during the stellar phase and the lunar phase in the evolution of the mythos, only the motherhood was divinized. And the divinization of the fatherhood happened at the point where we began to venerate in day sky, because the night sky was always associated with the spiritual realm, corresponding also to southern hemisphere, which corresponds to feminine, the feminine, while the northern hemisphere and the day sky correspond to the masculine. It's very important to understand. So we're going to focus on, we're going to keep coming back to this day sky, night sky conundrum, or this paradox. We're going to find that the struggles in the priest classes are largely regarding how we're propitiating the one great spirit and in what ways we're expressing our reverence or venerating this one great spirit. So with regard to the cubbyhole, what I'm endeavoring to do right now is try to, first of all, put emphasis on how important it is to understand. Obviously, it's a reference to a cub, which is a reference to a bear. We're going to learn that in the stellar mythos, they're venerating in southern, ultimately northern circumpolar constellations, where they ultimately preserved their knowledge into the constellation Ursa Minor, which is known as the Little Bear. That's very significant. Also associated with the idea of a cave, which is a place where something can be stored, or how the cave corresponds to the idea of the womb, that which is feminine. We have to understand the feminine principle is submissive, and contrary to that, the masculine principle is penetrative. So it's the masculine principle that represents the penetration of the physical world. So when we get into the significance of the implementation, starting with hafting stone onto stick, which we want to think of as double axe, that represents power. So before we have implementation, power is coming from the hand. But once we extend that power into the implementation, we have more power. So the implementation represents an advancement in our powers of reasoning and our powers of application to impact, penetrate, and affect the physical world. So it represents power. So double axe is the cleaver of the way. It's the idea that where we penetrate the physical world, we're cutting a path. That's why it's basically associated or stated as the cleaver of the way. So double axe is the cleaver of the way, or the great chief of the hammer. It represents power. It's very important to understand, because in the later phases of the mythology, we find the Tau cross, and we find ultimately Thor's hammer. These archetypes and these symbols, they still represent the same thing. Of course, obviously, it's right there in the letter T. No irony that we find it in the Christian cross in a lowercase form, because the archetype still is in that form. This double axe is very significant. And I'm trying not to go fully into the axe right at this point, because it's such a vast topic to understand, and it's pertaining to this evolution of this mythos, because as technology advances, the implementation advances, and the same concept is brought on into the new implementation. So cleaver of the way in axe form is brought on into the later implementation. So, at the point where, we introduce bow and arrow, then arrow and bow become cleaver of the way, or typified cleaver of the way. And then at the point where we have spear, that becomes cleaver of the way. And then on into sword becomes cleaver of the way. And associated with metallurgy, which is an advancement in technology. And then gunpowder and projectile weaponry becomes cleaver of the way. And then, nuclear warheads ultimately become cleaver of the way. We're wielding the forces of nature with the power to impact and penetrate the physical world. Our responsibility is to attain our full capacity for reasoning and take the responsibility that comes with being able to unlock these powers in the universe. So in science, for instance, just because we could doesn't mean we should. We have to have temperance. We have to take responsibility. Because what's happened as the mythos evolved, beginning in the early hero cults, what I want to refer to as the lesser mysteries are developed and formed. And these are a set of 7. And all of the knowledge was actually preserved in this set of 7, or in this number 7. So I know that's a hard thing to hear. It's a hard thing to understand, because what we first started talking about is how language was a degradation of the symbolism, because the idea was that they had developed a way to store massive amounts of knowledge in the most basic forms. So we have to understand how that's possible. It's possible because it's a matter of bringing the knowledge to the information.
And for people not familiar with like the symbol of the gavel, the original symbol, how does that look? And how does that, what does that mean when you say neter? How do they go together?
The symbol of the gavel is the point where we're evolving from totemic sociology into the first hero cult. So in that phase of the evolution, the reason is being applied. So the knowledge is first stored in symbol, in that particular symbol, which is 3 sticks crossed, and that is gavel. And 3 sticks crossed gives us 7 points. The center point and then the 6 exterior points of 3 sticks crossed is gavel. And that center point represents ultimately the hero, where the physical realm is penetrated by action. It represents the action that impacts the world, it penetrates the world, and leaves a lasting impact in the world. So the idea that we're doing God's work, that center point can only represent penetrating the physical world with right action when we're in alignment with proper purpose. We can't accidentally do the right thing. So the idea of the hero is that which, or he who, or they which understand the principles first. So before action, we have our principles in order. That's the idea. So the idea of Horus, for instance, one of the heroes in the Egyptian mythos, is that who has become like Horus. So to become like Horus is to understand the lesser mysteries. To not only understand the lesser mysteries, but to be able to demonstrate the lesser mysteries. The significance of the numerology is very important. It's interesting because just like in the alphabet, the vowel invokes the spirit and the consonants invoke the physical realm, or the description of the physical realm, or are inferring to that which is physical. In the number system, it's the odd numbers that invoke the spirit. So when we arrive at the 7, we have to understand that at that point, we've completed the octave in terms of a musical scale. Think of it, after 7 notes in the musical scale, we begin the new octave. So the 8 in that perspective is the 1. So it gets a little confusing there, because we have to understand that there's ancient number systems. So before we had the 2, we had the 1. And before we had the 3, we had the 1 and the 2. So the 1 and the 2 gave us the 3. And then we had the 4. So there's a natural order to the things. And I wanted to finish that point from the first segment. It starts out as a linear trajectory, and it's about how we're keeping, part of it is how we're keeping track of time. Why the way we're able to discover these long epochs of time is because of the way the ancient stellar people kept their time in the circumpolar constellations based on the great year cycle of 25,827 years. So in doing that, they were able to keep track of long periods of time and keep records of it. So when we went into the next phase of the evolution of the mythos, which is lunar, we compromised that method of timekeeping, which actually proved to be extremely detrimental to keeping the chronology intact. And ultimately that led from breaking our connection with ancestry and breaking away from the source of the evolution of the early mental processes, which ultimately led us astray. So the idea was that the original initial trajectory of the evolution of human mental processes is linear. But at the point where we begin to venerate and keep track of time in the annual cycles, that represents branching off of that linear trajectory in the lunar cycle. So that's a very critical juncture in the evolution of human mental processes. And then at the point where we go into the solar phase of the evolution of the mythos, again, we're branching off of that branch, and it's in the solar phase where it eventually goes completely awry. So that's one of the points I was trying to make earlier. I hope I'm coming through clearly on that. But see, again, with these number systems, there's a natural order to things. And we have to understand that there's ancient number systems that precede our current deca system, and that all the new discoveries and all new knowledge is sacred. So backing up, the idea that the 7 completes a cycle, then the 8 begins the new cycle. So in that respect, the 8 is the 1. So back up again. Odd numbers invoke the spirit. So the even numbers invoke the physical realm or refer to the physical realm. And this is paradoxical because we get to the 8, we associate the 8 with an even number, but the 8 is the 1, so that's an odd number. And then from the 8 to the 9, and then ultimately to the 10, where we enter into the double digits. So once we get past the 7, we're going into what we're going to call the greater mysteries, which were originally a set of 10, but ultimately augmented to a set of 12. So these numbers are very significant. We have to understand. So in between the 7 and the 12, we have the 8, 9, 10, and the 11. And most significantly, between the 12 and the 7, we have the 10, which represents the at-10. We have to understand that the at-10 gives us the power to unlock the forces in nature to the point where we can wield the forces in nature. So I want to tell you that the ancients understood there was danger there, which means they had knowledge that they held back for certain reasons, because in the general population or in the majority of the masses, to just hand that knowledge over without the temperance and the dedication to the foundations of the lesser mysteries, we had the potential to go into the greater mysteries and develop the greater mysteries and disregard those foundations, which are in regard to principles and first things where we have temperance. So what we have in the modern world is a case where we have the greater mysteries fully developed, but we've lost the lesser mysteries, which were in the 7. So in the modern world, we have the greater mysteries. We're into the 12. So all things 12 are dealing with the zodiac. So obviously there's a connection to the astronomy and cosmology. So we have to remember that the early hero cult were also the early astronomers. And their astronomers also meant that they were also the early cosmographers, which means they used the uranography to write and store knowledge into the cosmos, into groups of stars, what we call constellations. So without trying to get too far off track here, it's very significant to understand that the odd numbers invoke the spirit and that the even numbers invoke the physical realm. So when we get to the 8 is the 1, and that's an odd number. Now I want to finish this point. So in that respect, the 8 is an odd number, and then the 9 becomes an even number, and the 10 an odd number, and the 11 an even number, and the 12 an odd number, and then the 13 an even number, and the 14 an odd number. The 8 is the 1, so 9, 2, 10, 3, 11, 4, 12, 5, 13, 6, 14, 7. Now we're back to the 7. It's very confusing. We have to understand, and we keep moving that number system forward, we're going to keep finding that 7 corresponding into the multiples of 7. It's very significant because this is where the lesser mysteries are stored. So once we go past the 7, we're going into the greater mysteries, which originally were in a set of 10. So that was the 17 gnomes that were in Egypt based on the 7 lesser mysteries and then the 10 greater mysteries, which ultimately became 12. And all things 12 are dealing with the zodiac, and all things 7 are the little bear, which is Ursa Minor. So this is all related to the gavel because, we're back to the 3 sticks crossed coming from the totemic sociology into the early hero cult. We're dealing with this 7. And first they stored their knowledge in symbol in the form of gavel. And then they wrote it into the cosmography, into ultimately Ursa Minor in the north when it came into the north. And they stored all the knowledge into the 7 stars, which make up the constellation of Ursa Minor. And then they built the pyramids, which also represent the 7, which is 3 points of the triangle on top of the 4 points of the square. So triangle representing spiritual realm above the square, which represents physical realm. That's very important to understand. So that's what the pyramid actually is the ritual in stone of the 7. So first they wrote into symbol in the 7, and then they wrote it into the stars, into the cosmography, Ursa Minor, into the 7. And then ultimately built the pyramids, which is a ritual in stone of the 7, because they understood this. So the pyramid builders were the stellar cult, or the stellar people, or the stellar phase of the evolution of the mythos. So we have to understand that, number one, to understand their culture, we have to understand this is what they're endeavoring to do, is find a way to preserve this knowledge so it can't be destroyed. So the pyramid itself is not only a repository for the knowledge, it's also a temple that's built to be robust because they know it can be destroyed. So that reveals that they stored it in symbol and then ultimately wrote it into the cosmology first because they knew that that could not be destroyed. Now, the fact that the pyramid survived in the modern world is because it was built to be so robust, but it still could have been destroyed. Luckily, it hasn't been destroyed, but it still can be destroyed. So it's up to us to make sure that that does not happen. And we have to understand ultimately why it was built to appreciate what this knowledge is about. So the 7 represents the lesser mysteries. That doesn't mean less significant. It means the first things, the principles. And that's our foundations. So if we go into the greater mysteries without the temperance and the prioritization, or if we go into the greater mysteries without the lesser mysteries, it's akin to a kid who's found his dad's loaded gun. Humanity as an archetype of a kid who's found his dad's loaded gun. Because we're wielding, or we have the power to wield the forces of nature and unlock the powers of nature and wield the forces of nature without the temperance of the lesser mysteries. And obviously this is a big subject, so without trying to be too long-winded, yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you something that I find really interesting that you enlightened me to a couple years ago, which was when you're understanding the lesser mysteries in correspondence with the 10 and the 12, the greater mysteries, and then corresponding that to the, like you said, the zodiac and the 12 months. Can you tell us a little bit about the names of the months that are storing the actual names of the numbers of the 10? So the 12 to the 10. So remember what you talked about, the September, October, November, December, and then you said it's actually Septe.
Yeah, I know what you're getting at. Yeah, part of the corruption of the mythology is a result of trying to put a finer point on time. So as I said, the stellar people were keeping their time in the great year cycle of 25,827 years, which was chronicled by the shifting of the 7 circumpolar pole stars. So whatever the pole star is now, there's 6 more successors that will come and replace it as the northernmost star in that time period of 25,827 years. So each pole star, when it comes into primacy, will replace the pole star that's in primacy now, and each one will reign for about 3,600 years, ultimately divided into the 25,000, roughly 26,000 year cycle. I know this is a hard thing to understand, but focus first of all on northern circumpolar constellation, or northern circumpolar stars. So the stars that are closest to the pole are what we want to think of as the fixed stars. So they're always the most high. And the ones that are closest to the pole are fixed. So the farther away we get from the northernmost fixed point, the more we see movement in these stars. And the star that's in primacy now, we call it Polaris, but whatever star comes in to succeed Polaris is still going to be identified as Polaris. But right now, Polaris is the tip of the tail of Ursa Minor, which is the little bear. Tip of the tail of the little bear is Polaris currently. Eventually, that will be replaced by the next succeeding star. So these 7 stars that make up this circumpolar succession are a group of 7. And that entire group of these revolving circumpolar stars is venerated in the 7 and ultimately preserved in Ursa Minor, because while the North Pole star itself will change, Ursa Minor as a constellation will always be the closest constellation to the pole. So the other circumpolar constellations, or the other circumpolar constellations that have a pole star that will succeed the tip of the tail of the little bear, they will eventually come into primacy.
All right, so I think that's a good spot to take a break, and luckily it's nighttime. This episode is still not quite over because Douglas Martin is such an absolute legend. We have about 30 more minutes to go, so we're going to stop there, and since it's nighttime, I can stop there, stop recording, and then keep recording, and then we'll finish off the episode, and then we'll do episode number 9, and then all the rest of them to come. So stay tuned. I'm going to cut this one off, and stick around for the next episode. Yeah, thank you.